So now we are going to take a closer look at the Earth's evolution through geologic time. And again, this is about 4.5 billion years worth of Earth history, and we're going to try and smush it into 1 or 2 lectures. So here is that time scale that we were looking at, and we have a lot of history to talk about. So let's get started. So here is a diagram from the textbook, and it starts up here with the Big Bang, and then we have something called the Hadean, origin of life, Archean, the proterozoic. So we're going to go through all of these. And then once you have life appear, well, a long time after that, you start having more complex life. And then you have a great diversity of life appear. And once that appears, then we have a lot of different changes to life on Earth. So the geologic time scale is broken down into the Precambrian and the Phanerozoic. The Precambrian includes the Hadean, the Archean, and the Proterozoic. And then the Phanerozoic includes the Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and Cenozoic. So we'll get started with the beginning, the Precambrian history. Now it says 4.6, it's really 4.56 approximately. Okay. Just some books kind of round it up to 4.6. So the Precambrian history is when the oceans formed, when we formed an atmosphere, and when we had the formation of Earth's first continents and the appearance of the earliest life on Earth. And the Precambrian spans almost 90% of Earth history. Okay, so when we go back here, this whole entire thing, the Precambrian, that's 90% of Earth's history occurred from 4.56 billion years ago to about 541 million years ago. That's 90% of Earth history. And this diagram has a lot of information you can look through. Okay, so earlier in the semester, we talked more about the early molten uniform Earth and, you know, the bombardment from asteroids. We had discussed that early on. So we're not going to get into that part again. But you can still look at this diagram. It's pretty interesting. Lots of information in here, including later on in the diagram, there is more information that we're going to talk about. Okay, so what about the origin of the atmosphere and the oceans? So the Earth's primitive atmosphere consisted mainly of water vapor and carbon dioxide, as well as methane and ammonia. So it was a pretty toxic atmosphere in terms of if organisms that were alive today were to live there, they would be pretty toxic. The formation of the early atmosphere was greatly enhanced by the process of outgassing. So outgassing is when gases that are trapped inside the Earth, for example, the water vapor, sulfur dioxide, carbon dioxide, are released through volcanic eruptions. So you have gases from the Earth's interior coming out of the Earth's interior. So over time, those gases built up and developed the primitive atmosphere. And outgassing continues today, where we have volcanic eruptions. You also you may have just some venting where it's not necessarily a volcanic eruption. It might be more just a vent with gases coming out, which is more called like a fumarole. So then water vapor in the atmosphere eventually was able to start condensing once the early Earth was cool enough for condensation to happen. Okay, so the water vapor that came from the Earth's interior, or from the Earth and the outgassing, eventually the Earth was cool enough for that water vapor to condense. So then that formed clouds and then rainwater. And then the rainwater accumulated in lower lying areas on the Earth's surface. So this eventually led to the formation of the oceans. At approximately 4 billion years ago, the Earth was cool enough to have solid rock rather than its earlier molten stage, which again, we talked about earlier on in the semester, how the Earth at one point was a uniform molten body, and then it cooled and you had differentiation of the different materials depending on density, and that led to the formation of the layers of the Earth's interior. Now, actually, this may have been earlier than 4 billion years ago, which we'll discuss a little bit later. But once we had solid rock, we're going to start having the formation of our early continents. So the first crustal fragments formed as volcanic island arcs related to ocean crust that started to subduct. So you had pieces of ocean crust or basalt pieces, and you started to have them subduct, and then that led to the formation of volcanic arcs. Also, you had hot spots where you had magma rising to the surface, forming crustal pieces. And then these crustal pieces started to collide eventually. Also, you had erosion that produced sediments coming off of these crustal pieces. So these were the early crustal pieces, and they were more mafic at this point. It was more mafic rocks. So the crustal pieces eventually collided with one another, and that formed larger land masses that we call protocontinents. And those protocontinents experienced metamorphism and deformation. As you can see here, these rocks in this picture here are all, you see, folding inside there. Now the letters A, B, C, D, E can be seen on the previous diagram. It shows you the different pieces of crust. And then here it shows you them as part of this collision. And then you had melting occur deeper down, which produced felsic granite. That's shown as this red color here, the remelted crust. So you would have intrusions and plutons and metamorphic rocks and highly deformed rocks. And this would be a protocontinent. So this is our early continents. And these pieces, these crustal pieces of the protocontinents formed what we now call cratons. And specifically, we call some of these areas greenstone belts. So this line here is pointing to this section right here. That's a greenstone belt. So the Archean age crustal fragments involved in collisions resulted in the formation of orogenies with zones of deformed rock. So some of the areas of the deformed rocks are called greenstone belts. So this is a greenstone belt area on the coast of the Hudson Bay in northern Quebec. So these are ancient rocks. This rock here was dated to be 4.28 billion years old. So the oldest continental rocks have been dated at 4.374 billion years old. And this was determined by dating zircon crystals. So this tells us that continental crust formed at least 4.374 billion years ago. And this was dated using a zircon crystal in rocks from Jack Hills in Australia. So the Precambrian rocks that make up the stable main piece of every present-day continent is called a craton. And these cratons, while they used to be experiencing a whole lot of deformation and metamorphism and lots of igneous activity, after the Precambrian, those areas of rock were pretty stable. So we call those stable pieces from the Precambrian, we call them cratons. So where these pieces of rock are exposed at the surface, we call it a shield. But where it's buried beneath younger rocks, it's called a platform. And then the shield and the platform is the craton. So this is an example of some Precambrian cratons. This is in North America. And then the orange is the shield. And then we have some platforms. And then again, the shield and the platform equals the craton. Okay, and then you have younger pieces that got added onto the cratons later on in Earth's history. So you had the addition of, let's say, the Appalachian Mountains, things like that. Those were added onto the cratons later on in Earth's history. So here's a closer look. The exposed part of the North American craton is mainly in Canada, but it is also in Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, and New York. And that's labeled in pink on the diagram. So you can see this area down here is in New York. That's mainly the Adirondack Mountains in New York State. And this is what Precambrian bedrock would look like. This is one example in Canada, part of the Canadian Shield. So what about early life? One of the earliest known organisms were single-celled organisms that lacked a nucleus. These are called prokaryotes. One group of prokaryote is called cyanobacteria. And these organisms lived in the early oceans. They're also called blue-green algae. So they used solar energy, which is photosynthesis, to make their own food. As we know today, photosynthesis results in the release of oxygen. The photosynthesis of cyanobacteria eventually changed the composition of the Earth's atmosphere. Okay, so remember early on I said that the primitive atmosphere was very toxic to most of the organisms that were around. But these single-celled organisms called cyanobacteria that lived in the oceans, they used photosynthesis to make their own food. And we know from plants and other photosynthetic organisms today that photosynthesis results in the creation of oxygen, or the release of oxygen. Okay, so the photosynthesis of all the cyanobacteria actually changed the atmosphere of the Earth to have an increased amount of oxygen. So we call this the Great Oxygenation Event, and it was about 2.4 to 1.8 billion years ago. So these organisms created an oxygen-rich atmosphere on Earth. So this is showing organisms can actually alter the Earth. This was a very big change, actually. So it's pretty exciting. So these bacteria lived together in colonies in a gel-like material that we call a biofilm, or an algal mat. So it's like this gel that the cyanobacteria lived together in. And then you had sediment grains get stuck to the gel, the sediment, specifically calcium carbonate. The grains of sediment got stuck to the gel, and eventually you have these layered mound-like limestone structures that formed, and these are called stromatolites. And they form these ancient reefs. So it's not a coral reef, it's a stromatolite reef made as a result of these cyanobacteria. Okay, and these are what stromatolites look like. It's like these mounds in the water. So the oldest stromatolites found on Earth were dated to be 3.3 to 3.5 billion years old. And this is a cross-section of what stromatolites look like, where you see like these mounds. So now that the atmosphere and the oceans had this increased amount of oxygen, they became oxidizing. Okay, so now that we have oxygen, you have an oxidizing environment. Oxidation, we talked about when we did chemical weathering. That is when you have iron-rich materials get rusty. They're oxidized by oxygen. So you had any iron that you had before you had oxygen available in the atmosphere and the oceans, you did not have oxidation. But then once we had this increase in oxygen, you were able to have oxidation. So we have iron oxide present in the rock record. So we have, in the rock record, we have layers of iron oxide in the form of hematite and magnetite. And also we have chert layers. When chert is red, it's called jasper. And these rock formations are called banded iron formations, where we have these layers of different red and black material. Okay, so it's hematite, magnetite, and chert layers, and it's all related to iron and iron oxide. So this is evidence that the atmosphere and the oceans became oxidizing. Okay, so this is another piece of a banded iron formation. This is at the American Museum of Natural History in Manhattan. And again, these banded iron formations are evidence that the atmosphere and the oceans were oxidizing, where you don't have iron oxide before this in the rock record. This is further evidence of increased oxygen in the atmosphere and the oceans, is these red bed sandstone, shale, and siltstones, actually. But we call them red beds. This is a snapshot from the movie The Life's Rocky Start. These rocks are in Hammersley Range in Australia, and they are a bright orange from the iron oxide in the rocks. And again, that's all evidence that we had oxidation, evidence of widespread abundance of oxygen present in the atmosphere and in the oceans. And again, all of that oxygen is a result from photosynthetic cyanobacteria. So it's pretty amazing that these tiny organisms were able to change the atmosphere concentration of oxygen. They changed the composition of the atmosphere. And that led the way later for organisms that were able to use oxygen in respiration. Okay, we are able to take in oxygen and use it, right? Okay, so then we talked about life, we talked about the continents forming. Now, what about where the continents were positioned? So later in the Precambrian, after the proto-continents were formed, where were the continents? So the late Precambrian is called the proterozoic. You may have to go back and forth to that geologic time scale to remind yourself of what we're talking about and when. So in the early Proterozoic, there was a large continent composed of what is now known as North America, Greenland, and parts of Scotland and Scandinavia. And we call this large continent Laurentia. 1.3 to 1 billion years ago, more land was added to Laurentia, which led to the Grenville orogeny. That is the mountain building event that formed the Adirondack Mountains in eastern US. Once this Grenville orogeny happened and the extra land was added to Laurentia, we now had the formation of a supercontinent called Rodinia. Okay, so this is a picture of what Rodinia would have looked like at about 750 million years ago after it started to break apart again. But Rodinia existed from 1 billion years ago to 600 million years ago. Ancestral North America was located near the center of the supercontinent. Note that this is the location of the equator, and that part of North America was south of the equator at this point. So Rodinia began to break apart about 800 to 600 million years ago. So this is a summary of the Precambrian rocks. So the Archean rocks, which was the early Precambrian, are usually highly deformed granites, gneisses, deep water sediments, and green stones from the metamorphosed ocean crust. Proterozoic rocks, which are later in the Precambrian, are usually less deformed, shallow water shelf sediments, because once the continents were formed, there were more continental shelves, which is more shallow water. So you were able to form shallow water sediment. Also, we have the banded iron formations. So now we're going to get into the Phanerozoic. So the Phanerozoic is divided into the Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and the Cenozoic eras. Okay, so the Phanerozoic is an eon, and then these are eras. And then the eras are broken down further into periods. So we're going to start off with the Paleozoic era. Okay, so that's the earliest of the Phanerozoic eon. Now don't worry, you don't have to memorize all these words. Okay, I'm not going to have you memorize all these things. So the Paleozoic era was broken down into the Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian, Carboniferous, and Permian. And the Carboniferous is broken down into the Pennsylvanian and Mississippian. And here's another one of those timeline diagrams. So the Cambrian is early on. And then you could see some different organisms in this diagram here. And then here you have the Carboniferous, the Permian. And again, you see some changes in the organisms in the diagram. There's some other information in here as well. And it shows you where the continents were at different time periods. So you can look at where the continents were located. So after Rodinia broke apart, many of the continental fragments reassembled into a large landmass in the southern hemisphere that we call Gondwana. So here's the southern hemisphere. Here is the equator. This is Gondwana. So look at Antarctica over here near the equator. That's fun, right? Look at Siberia on the equator. So continents were in different locations than they are today, right? They would have had a different climate. So underneath all that glacial ice on Antarctica, we would expect to find some evidence that Antarctica used to be tropical, right? We'd find some tropical fossils, some sediments related to tropical environments. Okay, so that's Gondwana, consisting of South America, Africa, India, Australia, and Antarctica. And this is where Laurentia was on the equator. And that is where North America, that's North America, or part of Laurentia is present-day North America. So sea level changed many times during the early Phanerozoic, and this led to periods of time when shallow seas covered most of the land. These shallow seas that covered continental crust were called eperic seas or epicontinental seas. And when sea level rises onto land, we call it a transgression. When sea level lowers, we call it a regression. So one of the examples of these continental seas was the Sauk Sea. And this is the example showing North America specifically. And this was during the Cambrian period. So the Cambrian was 541 million years ago to 485 million years ago. So here is that Sauk Sea. So this is the first major sea level transgression, or the formation of an eperic sea onto the North American continent. The Sauk Sea covered most of North America, except for a few large islands, which were really just land that remained above sea level. And we call that the transcontinental arch. Okay, so we look in the middle of North America here. This is not, today it's not an island, but during the Epiric Sea, when most of North America was covered in seawater, this part was above the water surface. So it may have looked like islands, but it's really part of North America, the continent. Okay, and then if we look, the different colors here show different types of rocks that formed related to the seawater. So we have pink is beach, that's beach sediments or shallow sediments that you would find near a beach. And then we have the yellow is shallow water mud. And then the purple is limestone. So the shallow water mud would be shale. That would be shale today, for example, maybe some siltstone type rocks. The limestone, you see extensive areas of purple. So that means today we should find large areas of limestone rock in those areas. Okay, and beach is more going to be like sandstone, for example. And then this shows you the middle of the Ordovician. Just going back here, the Ordovician is the next period. So this is showing you the shallow seawater and where you had dry land. Now this volcanic arc here, we learned about that when we talked about the tectonic orogeny that formed mountains in New York City. Okay, we talked about a volcanic arc colliding with ancestral North America. That happened around this time period in the Ordovician. So that's this piece of land that's going to collide with North America and form those mountains. And then note where the equator was. The equator is in the same spot as it is today. It's showing you the orientation of North America in the same orientation it is in today, so that we understand where in North America was under seawater. So then they're showing you where the equator was. But really this piece of land should be in a different orientation. If we were to look at a globe from the Ordovician, this really should be like that. Okay, does that make sense? So like they're just showing you in the diagram so that you can understand the way North America is today. Like they're showing you the states and everything in this diagram as well. So there is a lot of evidence that we had shallow seas that covered the continents. We have thick marine sediment deposits over large areas of land, including limestone, shale, and sandstone, which makes sense because we have here limestone, mud, which would be shale, and the beach areas would be sandstone. Okay, so today we find a lot of that type of sediment around North America and around the whole world. But the example we're looking at right now, the diagram shows North America specifically. You would also find marine fossils on land, ancient reefs, and evaporite minerals such as salt, gypsum. Okay, so we actually have, in parts of this country, we have salt deposits related to when sea level was higher. Then I have this video clip that refers to sediments deposited in a sea that existed 80 million years ago in what is now Kansas. That's not the same time period that we're talking about at this point, but it is a good representation of sediments that form in a shallow sea that cover continental areas.
Western Kansas, a series of spectacular shapes burst up out of the plains. They're called monument rocks. And the raw material for these towering structures was formed more than 80 million years ago by the smallest of creatures. This place is amazing. I've been looking for just a few minutes, and here's a shell. It's an oyster shell. I've been finding these things all over the place. And this whole place is made of shells. There's really big ones, there's small ones, and even the chalk itself is made of microscopic shells. So why are there shells here? Answer, Kansas used to be covered by a massive inland sea. Over time, the giant oysters living on the seafloor were buried by billions of tiny plankton shells as they died and fell to the bottom of the sea. Layer after layer. Over millions of years, all that weight compressed them into chalk. When the sea finally drained, that chalk got left behind. Millions of years of erosion sculpted the chalk, leaving behind these curious outcrops that now surge skywards out of Kansas.
Okay, so yeah, they're showing you all that chalk that formed, and that is further evidence that that part of Kansas was covered in seawater. And then here are some coral fossils in parts that were in a part of New Jersey that's near the Delaware Water Gap. And these coral fossils are not near the coasts. That's not where they were found. They're in the middle of land, okay? And these are from the Silurian period. I did not date them. They were dated already. So we know that that area of New Jersey is Silurian in age. So Silurian is here, 443.4 to 419 million years ago. So these Silurian age corals tell us that there was a shallow tropical sea covering the land there. Okay, so that's really strong evidence for sea water covering the land. Okay, so just to summarize, evidence for shallow seawater covering continents are that now we have thick marine sediment deposits that are like limestone, shale, and sandstone, marine fossils, ancient reefs, and evaporate minerals like salt. So then this is during the Silurian and Devonian. This is what's going on with the continents. So Laurentia then collided with Baltica, Avalonia, and South America. So here you have, again, that tectonic orogeny that happened in the Ordovician. And then here's Avalonia. And then here's this ocean, the Iapetus Ocean. Okay, so here's Avalonia. And we have seen this before when we talked about mountain building. Okay, we had the tectonic orogeny, and then we had Avalonia offshore here. Okay, and then eventually Avalonia collided onto the rest of this land over here, adding on to the tectonic mountains. And that formed the Akkadian orogeny. Okay, so this diagram here shows you before the collision of Avalonia with the rest of North America. Okay, so this is before that Akkadian orogeny. Okay, and then this is what the seawater was doing. Okay, now you have the Akkadian orogeny has happened. You have a lot of sediments that came from the Akkadian orogeny were deposited next to it, forming the Catskill Delta. Again, here is the location of the equator. So North America was still on the equator. And then at the late Paleozoic, Gondwana moved northward and collided with Laurasia, and that formed Pangaea. So the Alleghanian orogeny occurred when Africa and North America collided, and that resulted in the formation of the Appalachian Mountains. So here's Africa and here's North America. And once this collision happened, that formed the Appalachian Mountains, and that was the final collision in the creation of Pangaea. And that happened at the end of the Paleozoic, or we call it the Permian period. So this red square here is shown here. Okay, so this shows you the Alleghanian orogeny right here. And here you have this large coal swamp area. Okay, so that is where a lot of our coal formed. That formed during the period called the Carboniferous. So next we're going to talk about life in the Paleozoic era. So that's coming next.